Hi folks, welcome back. In the previous video, I discussed what the various Syrian factions ought to do in order not to repeat the mistakes of the past. In this video, I'll be discussing the 7 or 8 or 9 various different outside actors, outside players, both regional ones, Syria's neighbors, as well as those in far distant lands, to discuss what they should do and not do when dealing with Syria. Surprise, surprise, we'll start with my country, Turkey. I'll start with bad news, especially for the haters out there. Turkey, not Israel, deserves the bulk of the credit for the toppling of the Assad regime in Syria. I appreciate the argument of Israel taking on Hezbollah and Iran in Syria, etc. But had it not been for Turkey supporting the rebels since the start of the civil war in 2011, they would have perished under Bashar al-Assad's boots and those of Russia and Iran, the main backers of the deposed Syrian president. Now, of course, Turkish policy towards Syria since the start of the civil war was not always consistent, save for arguing that Syria's territorial integrity should be maintained. Turkish policy waxed and waned. Originally, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan supported the rebels to the hilt, but then the civil war ground to a halt in 2020, so Mr. Erdogan sought ways to end the conflict through a negotiated settlement. He extended a hand to Assad, who ignored him, and then the rebels in turn toppled Assad. It's that simple. Now, while pursuing its own interests, Turkey made sure that it wouldn't alienate Russia, Iran, and the US, the other major outside stakeholders in the Syrian civil war, especially wanting to avoid confronting all three at the same time. We're not there yet, one thing at a time. Now, while a lot of folks here in Turkey are jubilant, the message coming out of the Erdogan administration is one of cautious optimism, and more optimistic than cautious, encouraging Syrians to leave the pain and the tears and the suffering of the past behind them and look forward to building a better future for all Syrians, all the while telling non-Syrian actors not to worsen the situation. So for Turkey, the main issue, which I alluded to in my previous video, is that of the US-backed YPG SDF. This group is connected to the PKK. That's an organization that is recognized as a terrorist group by the United States, by the European Union, which has been fighting the Turkish government since the 1980s. Now, I'll just maintain my own optimistic outlook from the previous video and assume that the YPG SDF is going to play it smart and, just like it did in 2015, have a change of brands and make them look more palatable to Ankara. By the way, if you're the sort of person who's going to take me to task in the comment section, writing things like, oh, all of you Turks hate Kurds and you're just a bunch of genocidal maniacs, or supporting jihadis, etc., just spare me, folks, please. Just assume that I'm right and you're wrong. No, but seriously, Kurds did suffer, occasionally, yes, at the hands of Turks. But that sort of historical grievance simply does not translate into an asset in present-day geopolitics. By the way, upon second thought, do write whatever you want to write in the comment section. The more comments I get, the more views I get, the visibility of my channel goes up. And that gets me closer to monetization. So do that, please. And don't forget to click like and subscribe and turn on notifications so that I can keep making videos like this one. Okay, so as I was saying, it would be really great if and when moderate Syrian Kurdish groups can step up to the plate, especially those affiliated with the Kurdish National Council of Syria, who had been marginalized by the YPG SDF in 2016, and assume control of the Syrian side of the Turkish-Syrian border. Because one problem, as I mentioned, the YPG SDF is an extension of the PKK, and as long as the organization stays in its present shape, with its present leadership, with its present ideology, there's going to be a Turkish intervention there, because it looks like the Americans are going to leave once Trump assumes office. Now, bracketing the YPG SDF issue, two other matters will remain salient for Ankara. One of them is the return of the Syrian refugees in Turkey, and the other one is the reconstruction of Syria. Of the 3 million or so Syrians living in Turkey, and unofficial figures put that number at a much higher level, it is expected that quite a few of them will return home to Syria in the days and years ahead. And that will mean the Turkish economy will have some booms and some bumps. For example, Syrians who used to work below minimum wage jobs leaving will mean prices will go up because employers will have trouble finding workers, and that they would have to pay more for those workers, now many of them Turkish, which means that they will have to pass on those costs on their consumers. But over time, real wages will probably improve in Turkey, even as demand on things such as housing, food, and transportation, etc., will go down because of lower demand, fewer Syrians, etc. And that will have a positive effect on the inflation rate in Turkey. Of course, all of that works provided that the Turkish economy can continue to create new jobs. The flip side of that is fewer Syrians means fewer consumers in the Turkish economy, which means a slightly lower GDP growth, slightly lower Turkish GDP. Of course, what the Turkish economy will lose in growth rates, in GDP, I think will be more than made up by efforts to rebuild Syria. Economically speaking, Turkey, with its population of 85 million people, is just a smaller version of China with 1.4 billion people. We're much smaller, yes, but with an equally able industrial and construction sector that can basically build and produce virtually anything. And much of the construction equipment to rebuild Syria, as well as the material needs of Syrian people, will be coming from Turkey in the days ahead. Of course, that brings us to the next question: who's going to pay for all of that? We just don't have hundreds of billions of dollars we can lend to our Syrian friends, especially considering the fact that the final price tag of Syria's reconstruction is estimated to be about $500 billion. Yes, that's $500 billion, Mr. Powers. Austin Powers and Dr. Evil. I really have to update my jokes. And that's where our second set of outside players come in. Gulf Arabs, specifically the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. Ahlan wa sahlan, folks. Now, originally, an overwhelming majority of Arab countries had two main concerns about Turkish involvement in Syria, except Qatar, because Qatar is a close ally of Turkey. One of them was neo-Ottomanism. From the Arab perception, that's basically us Turks hearkening to our ancient and revered traditions and liberating other lands that didn't know they wanted to be liberated until we showed up. I'm joking, of course. Syrians actually asked for our help at the beginning of the civil war, and we delivered, and the dictator is out. It's important to note, folks, the civil war in Syria was not about the Ottoman Empire any more than it was about the Seljuk Empire or the Mongol Empire or the Golden Horde Empire or anything of the sort. It was about physical security, human security, geopolitics, logistical and energy routes, but most importantly, it was about extremist groups. So to address all of that, probably the most important weapon that Gulf Arabs possess come into play: money. As I mentioned, rebuilding Syria is going to cost somewhere around $500 billion, give or take a few dozen billion. So especially the seed money that's going to jumpstart the Syrian economy would have to come from somewhere. And so I think this is really the moment for rich Arab countries to shine. And I don't really mean this just from an Arab or Islamic solidarity standpoint. Supporting initial financing of Syrian reconstruction is also good business. It's also good politics. It's good diplomacy. A functional Syria that is rebuilding itself, that is recovering from the wounds of the past, means there won't be any miasmic swamps where things like ISIS can regrow. It also means no refugees going to other countries, regional countries, and in this context, no videos to radicalize youth in the Middle East or around the world. And with the next comment, I'm really going to show my idealistic side. There's an even bigger symbolic value in Arab countries, other Middle Eastern countries helping Syria rebuild. By coming up with their own version of a Marshall Plan for Syria, Middle Eastern countries could prove that we're finally turning a new page in this part of the world. And that way we could at least show, if not completely convince, our Western partners that their main client in this part of the world, Israel, should choose to become part of this new Middle East and also allow Palestinians to partake in that new Middle East by granting them an independent state. I'll come to the Israelis in a second. I want to briefly look at Iran. That's our outside player number 3. Now, Assad's fall is a major slap in the face for the Iranians, who are estimated to have spent anywhere between $30 billion to $50 billion to prop up the Syrian dictator. Interestingly, Tehran seems to be taking this quite stoically. I think part of the reason is that Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian and his quite moderate reformist administration wants to continue its rapprochement with regional countries such as Saudi Arabia, such as the United Arab Emirates. And of course, over the horizon, from January 20 onwards is the question of how Donald Trump is going to approach Iran's nuclear program. But even in this uncertain future, there are ways to get Iran to play a more constructive role in Syria. One way to do that would be to convince Tehran to disband the militias that it brought from places like Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, while also withdrawing whatever IRGC troops may be remaining within Syria. To further assuage Iran's concerns regarding Syria, Turkey, along with Iraq, can help to connect Iran to the planned development road project, and then perhaps plan new logistical and energy routes that will connect Iran to Europe. I told you I was being extremely optimistic. There's a higher probability of things going south than all of this rosy picture that I'm depicting in these videos. But it is easy to be pessimistic. It's more time and energy consuming, brain cell consuming to be optimistic. But in order to burnish my credentials as a hardcore realist, I offer you country number 4, Israel, which is the one that really worries me in this picture. Upon the news that Bashar al-Assad had left Syria, the Israelis' first reaction was to bomb all sorts of Syrian military and intelligence facilities, and then grab chunks of Syrian territory at a time when the country is too weak to defend itself. Meanwhile, some genius commentators from Israel and pro-Israeli circles in the West came up with asinine maps that show Israeli-occupied Golan Heights connecting to YPG SDF areas in northeast Syria. I'm sorry, this is going to be a bit graphic, folks. A map is not an erotic magazine. You can't just color it with the first thing that comes out of your mind. You need to have an inkling of things like logistics, civil engineering, geography, especially demographics, and topography, ethnography, things like who lives where, what do they do, what do they dislike. You're not going to get the Sunni Arab south, the Druze south of Syria, which do not like Israel, connect to northeast Syria in a way that's going to benefit Israel. Also, I don't think it's a good idea to build a straight road for hundreds of kilometers through the Syrian desert, where the only service stations and gas stations will be run by ISIS members. Get a grip, guys. Be like my man Zohan. Be smart. Be strong. Now, I get that Israel has security concerns, but the best way to ensure one's security cannot come from humiliating one's neighbor or making sure that they're insecure. If the attacks of October 7th have proven anything, that neighbor which you habitually humiliate can come and humiliate you at the moment you will least expect. So the best option for Israel here is to create the conditions where, if it is intent on keeping the Golan Heights, it should be ready to trade something with the new Syrian government down the road. I don't know, maybe agree to rent the place or something in return for large sums of money. Or be prepared to negotiate Camp David 1979-like agreement the way Israel did with Egypt. Of course, that can only happen once Syria has a duly elected, properly formed government, not the current interim mechanism. But along the way, it would be smart for Israel to build some goodwill with Syrians. And bombing their territory and military bases and facilities is not smart. Of course, being the hard-headed realist that I am, I'm assuming that Israel wants to live in peace in this part of the world with its neighbors. But maybe that's not the case at this point in time. Okay, that's regional actors and what they can do to help rebuild Syria. Now let's quickly look at the far distant lands. Starting with number 5, the Europeans. Ah ya, mais oui. In the initial days of the post-Assad period, the Europeans once again failed the morality test. News came out that about a dozen European countries immediately stopped accepting asylum applications from Syrians because Assad is gone. There's no reason for them to seek asylum elsewhere anymore. They can just go back to their countries. Because, as soon as Assad leaves, Syria all of a sudden becomes paradise. That's not the case, of course. There are possibly 6 million Syrians who fled the country and now live abroad. It's unthinkable that all of a sudden all of them can just return home. That's not going to happen. Now, I get the anti-refugee sentiment. We have a lot of that here in Turkey, so I'm not here to lecture the Europeans on that one. But if they do want to expedite Syrians' return home, they should help facilitate better living conditions for all Syrians, along the lines I described earlier in the video. But appreciate that all of that is not going to happen in a day or two, or even in a month or two. Okay, number 6, the Russians. One of the surprising things in all this is that Russian President Vladimir Putin and his team have taken the rapid fall of Syria rather calmly. Maybe they expected it, and it looks like they even accepted it, maybe begrudgingly. And news reports indicate that even before the fall of Damascus, Assad fleeing the country, HTS had made outreaches to the Russians, pledging that if they have any troops in the hinterland, that they will be granted safe passage, and their naval bases, their air bases in the Latakia-Tartus area will not be attacked. And by and large, HTS and other rebel groups seem to have kept that promise. Medium to long term, I expect the Russians to continue partnering up with Turkey and Iran to make sure that Syria is stable and engage other regional actors I mentioned to protect its interests. Now, whether it can get its air base and its naval base back, that I'm not sure, but we'll see in due time. They're probably going to want them back, but we don't know. All right, and that brings me to number 7 and our final outsider, America. Now, there are a few issues for the United States. One of them is try to keep the YPG SDF viable for as long as possible, because that organization has been the main U.S. ally in the Syrian civil war. But I would argue that there are smarter ways of staying relevant in Syria and protecting Syrian Kurds without attaching yourself to the PKK Syrian offshoot and then offend one of your main NATO allies, i.e. Turkey, a country that the United States often needs in times of troubles, not only in its immediate region, but sometimes even in distant lands. Unfortunately, we're still seeing this sort of messaging coming from otherwise respectable thinkers on American foreign policy, such as Senator Chris Van Hollen, who's been tweeting as if YPG-SDF is America's one and only option in Syria, while ignoring all the other actors I mentioned in my previous video. It's just not good politics. And from the American point of view, if Congress and the incoming Trump administration do not come up with a viable plan to engage other parties in the conflict, even while fulfilling President Trump's pledge to remove U.S. forces from Syria, then the United States is not going to maintain any influence in Syria over that conflict and other regional stakeholders, including, among them, close U.S. allies such as Jordan, such as the Gulf Arabs, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, as well as Jordan and Lebanon. Mr. Trump might order U.S. forces out of Syria, influence lost, although I don't think he's going to do that, because the one thing I'm pretty sure he wants to avoid is looking like Joe Biden over Afghanistan in the summer of 2021. You want influence, you got to play it smart. And here, I kind of hate saying this. I'm not holding my breath to see that the United States is going to pursue a wise course of action. For example, doing things like putting a leash on Netanyahu and his extremists in the Israeli cabinet. As a student of Cold War U.S. foreign relations, in those days, the Americans got themselves into trouble a lot, but they often understood what was going on around the world and formulated policies accordingly. Whereas these days, American foreign policy often looks like an episode of South Park or a sketch on Monty Python. So I guess my advice to the Americans would be along the lines of what former Secretary of State Dean Acheson told the British in the late 1960s when they decided that they wanted to withdraw their strategic assets from the east of the Suez. Be American, folks. Used to be good about reaching out to different groups, different countries that did not see eye to eye with you, and engage different factions, different political parties, different interest groups in any given country, in any given region, so that you can remain relevant in this part of the world without getting over-involved, especially militarily. By the way, I'm serious about Netanyahu. You really got to put a lid on that guy. I don't know what it is. I can continue prescribing treatments to various parties, and as a doctor of history, I feel that I can do that, but I'm going to stop. And as I mentioned previously, I would love to keep in touch and continue the conversation. So if you have any questions or thoughts, please write them in the comments section below. And don't forget to follow me on social media, X, aka Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn on notifications. I'm Kayaoğlu. Thank you for watching.